The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you. Once more, Jesus spoke to the chief priests and Pharisees in parables. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. And he sent other slaves, saying, "Tell those who have been invited, 'Look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. And he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The word of the Lord. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Father Chris and Father Marcel for having me this weekend for my ministry of preaching, but also thank you to all of you for being welcoming and hospitable with me to share this moment of faith and of hope with you. Most time when I meet new people, one of the questions, and I tell them I'm a seminarian and studying to become a priest, there is a pattern. Most time, one of the questions they ask me is like, "What is your story of vocation, or what made you to decide to become a seminarian and be a priest?" And I usually tend to say that the story of my vocation is always a story of an encounter with God. An encounter that means God has been so hospitable to me that I have decided to be hospitable to other people as well. And that's by becoming a priest. That's my way of becoming hospitable to other people. And so sharing the gift of myself with others. Well, that's not all. But I'm saying that because in the gospel today we hear Jesus pronouncing these words, "For many are called, but few are chosen." And it's a saying of being called to about anything in life. And if there is one thing that I'd like that we share in this moment as we meditate on the readings and the gospel today is this. In Jesus Christ, God constantly and always calls and chooses each one of us, and he calls us to a deeper relationship with him. He calls us to be hospitable with him. And the question will be, how do we do that? Well, there are many ways that we can do that, but in this homily, I'm going to suggest that we ponder on what Jesus is telling us in the gospel today. One preacher I know once told me, every homily or like every preaching that a priest does or a deacon does is always an instrument of initiating people to that deeper relationship with God. And as such, every homily has to answer three questions. And it's those three questions that I'd like that we answer today. So it's the question, what? Now what? And so what? So those three questions, I like that we try to answer those questions following the readings today. First of all, what? What is going on in the gospel today or in the readings today? But before we answer that question, let's put the gospel into context first of all. If you have good memory or if you are very familiar with the Bible or with the way the readings, the gospels are chosen, you are going to realize that over the last couple of weeks, we've been reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Well, we finished chapter 21 last week, and the Gospel today is taken from the beginning of chapter 22, where Jesus is telling what we call a triad of parables, meaning he's been telling three parables. Remember, the week before, there was a parable of a father who was telling to his children, can you go to my farm? And the other said, I'm gonna go, but he did not go. And the other said, I'm not gonna go, but he ended up going. And then last week we heard the parable of the wicked tenants. And today Jesus tells another parable, the parable of the wedding banquet. So that's why we say Jesus tells the triad of parables. And the question is, why does Jesus tell parables? Parables, first of all, are stories that are being told, and people are supposed to make meanings from those stories. So as we hear the story of the gospel today, we are also called to make meaning out of that story. And what does this parable say to us? So the question, what still? Well, every parable does two things. First of all, it gives us a window. We call it the window parable. It's a window into something beyond just what is being told. For example, at the beginning of the gospel today, we heard Jesus say, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. So the window that this parable gives us is the story that Jesus is telling is a window into what the kingdom of God may look like. And the second thing that a parable does is it's a mirror. You know, when you have a mirror, you are confronted with yourself. You see yourself into the mirror. So we call it the mirror parable because it calls us to identify the role that suits us in the story that is being told. For example, when we hear the story of the gospel today, I'm confronted with the questions, Am I the persons that are being sent to call the guests to come to the wedding banquet? Or am I the people that were invited but refused to come to the banquet or to the feast? Or am I the people that were taken from the streets to come to the banquet? Or am I the one who came to the banquet but without a wedding robe? So that's the role of a mirror parable. So it gives us a mirror to find our place into the story that's being told. So that's pretty much what is going on in the gospel today. So we're supposed to find our role into the story that's being told. After we've found the role, so what? So that's my second question today. So what does this story have to do with you? What does it have to do with me here today? One writer once says, when you do read the Bible or read the Gospels, you're not gonna find facts or truths about what Jesus did in the past or how Jesus lived in the past, but you are going to find the impact of what Jesus did in the past, and the impact of the people that lived with Jesus. So that's why there is that impact in the gospel. So it's that impact that I want that we find in the gospel today. So the question is still, what does it have to do with you? What does it have to do with me today? Well, Jesus tells us today, and he teaches us about hospitality and being inclusive. And inclusive means being able to have an attitude of being welcoming. Welcoming not only the people that we feel that they should be welcomed, also the people that sometimes do challenge us. So he calls us to being inclusive. And so if we're not inclusive, otherwise we will end up marginalizing those people or marginalizing those things that we think they're not worth paying attention to. And in most cases, especially in the culture we live in today, sometimes there is a temptation that because we're too busy most of the time, the first person we end up marginalizing is God. Marginalize God because we just have too much on our plate that we don't have time for God at all. So that's why Jesus calls us to inclusion. And so the story or the parable of the wedding banquet calls us to being inclusive. And the person to whom we have to be hospitable and inclusive, first of all, it's God. It's from that relationship of inclusion with God that we draw other relationships with other people, with the people we love, with the people we care for. So it's the hospitality with God first. We have to have it first. Only then can we be able to be hospitable and inclusive to other people around us. And so that's why I want to draw your attention to a danger that's very prominent, perhaps for many of us today, and that's the danger of indifference. So that's why Jesus in the gospel today calls also that we pay attention to the danger of indifference. As we heard in the gospel today, the king who throws his wedding party, he invites the people, but they're so busy, they're so indifferent that they just don't want to be there, they don't want to come. So indifference is an attitude that's very internal, and it's a mindset. That's why it's a danger that we have to pay attention to first and most of all. So that was my so what? Does this have to do with us? And my third point, my third question is, now what? Yes, you know, Jesus is calling you to hospitality. He's calling you to being inclusive. He's calling you to not be indifferent. Now what? Well, to finish, friends, I want us to be aware that being Catholic or faith is about a relationship not with ideas, or a relationship not with how things are done in the church, but a relationship with a person, and that's the person of Jesus. So faith is that encounter with Jesus. As a community of faith, we are always being called to this encounter and to know how this encounter works. So Jesus calls us today to being welcoming, to be loving. Why? Because, as one of the fathers of the church says, love and goodness always tend to diffuse themselves, or they always tend to share themselves. No? Love is not self-containing, it's not self-centered. Or love does not always look at its own interest first. But love is always hospitable. Love is always self-expanding because it gives itself to the other person. Christ is the one who shows us the way because he's expanding himself, he's sharing himself with us. He always diffuses himself with us. And you might ask me, how does he do that? Well, soon enough, we are going to bring the offerings on the altar. And the Eucharist is the summit and the moment when Jesus diffuses himself with us. The moment when Jesus shares himself with us. The moment when Jesus is hospitable with us. So he calls us to be hospitable as he is.